Okay, hi guys, I'm Marissa, and today I'm refuting Andrew's claim that cannabis can cure a variety of cancer cells. My statement today is that there's not enough evidence gathered to prove his claim, and that the evidence that he has provided is flawed. A mere 5 years ago, Harvard University released information on a study about the effects of THC on cancer cells. In this experiment, it was the one where they injected standard doses of THC into mice who were implanted with human lung cancer cells. Keep a note that this study was only conducted for a mere 3 weeks. Around the same time, Dr. Sean McAllister was also conducting the exact same experiment as the Harvard one, but instead of using lung cancer cells, he was using brain cancer cells. While both of these studies had very similar results, my opponent bases his claim off of just these two examples. The flaw in this assumption is that after only having 2 studies, he's already jumping to the conclusion that cannabis can already cure a variety of cancer cells. Also, because of how recent these studies were, it's a little early to assume these things, because when you're dealing with things in the medical field, it takes a long time to assume. Another thing to take into consideration is that these studies weren't even conducted on humans, they were tested on mice. If cannabis truly is the cure to cancer, then research would already be done on humans right now. I would also like to point out that during my opponent's speech, he only had one claim that he talked about to prove his point, and the one claim was the 2 examples that he used were the Harvard University one and Sean McAllister's example. On the outline that he gave me, he had a claim targeting pharmaceutical companies and was stating that they are blocking the legalization of marijuana. However, no such statement was made in his argument, leaving the only subject to be the 2 studies. As for sourcing information, because I had such little amount of information to work with, I decided to do an investigation on his sources, and after reviewing some of the sources, I came to conclude that one source, the Natural News, is not credible after reading numerous reviews from numerous websites because of 2 mishaps where it claimed the FDA had said some things and they had never stated such facts. So some of his sources are unreliable to begin with. And while the evidence can look hopeful, there's still not enough information to actually prove this claim. Before I wrap this up, I would like to leave you with one statement that comes from Dr. Preet, who is actually the lead researcher in the Harvard study, and her statement concluding their research was, "THC offers promise, but we have a long way to go before we know what the potential is."
All right, well, the main claim's labeled. In fact, I guess it's the only claim, so it's pretty easy to follow the argument. And it basically comes down to a reasoning challenge here that the advocate is making a hasty generalization from an insufficient amount of evidence at this particular point. It would be good at this point to maybe do a review of what kind of research has been done on THC or other elements of marijuana on cancer treatment. And this is where, if you were doing a paper, if you were writing your dissertation, if you were getting ready for a senior project, you'd do a review of literature. And I think that the only literature that we have that is being presented by either side are these 2 particular studies. I'm sure that other research has been done in this field. I don't know how extensive it has been. I don't know whether or not it leads to the same kinds of conclusions. I would also point out, I think that you want to point out that the advocate's evidence was presented from a few years ago, and it would seem to suggest that there should have been follow-up studies on this particular point. If there's been an absence of follow-up research using these techniques, there may in fact be a reason for a lack of follow-up, and that is that there's a lack of promise on this, or that there are more promising alternatives than THC as a way of treating cancer, that we're closer to being able to utilize those. And I think that, like I said, a review of literature would give you a little bit more content to argue about here. I do think, however, that you've got the right argument here, and that is that this is a hasty generalization. You mentioned that the studies were relatively short. They were on animals. They weren't on human beings. They're on two different types of cancers. And the best piece of information that you have is the one that comes from the author of one of those studies, which simply says, like you said right at the end, it's promising, but we've got a long way to go and before we can make any of these inferences, which seems to be completely different from what the advocate is talking about. So I think you've got a good press on this argument. It's relatively easy to follow because it's not intricately involved. Mentioning that the other argument existed but was not developed, I think that's pretty reasonable given that you got it on the outline. The challenge on Natural News was not quite clear to me. Was Natural News the place that the articles, that the studies were published in, or were they simply reporting on that? Or was that a criticism about the pharmaceutical companies? It wasn't clear to me where that evidence came from. So I'm not sure how the challenge that you're making there affects the conclusion that we're talking about here. All right, thank you.